Most people say they want God to lead their lives. It sounds beautiful, safe, holy. But Saint Thérèse of Lisieux would gently remind us that letting God lead is not primarily a feeling, it is a surrender. And surrender always has a cost. The soul often imagines God's guidance as something comforting, as if God will simply confirm what the soul already wants, as if letting God lead will make life smoother, clearer, and easier. Sometimes it does, but often it does the opposite. Because God does not lead the soul to protect its comfort. He leads the soul to shape its heart, and shaping always involves loss of control, loss of personal timelines, loss of preferred outcomes, loss of the illusion that you know what is best for you. This is where many stop, not because they reject God, but because they resist being led. Saint Thérèse would say that the deepest surrender is not giving God your plans, it is giving God your right to plan. That is a very different thing. The soul says, "Lord, guide me," but inside it often adds, "You, as long as I understand." The soul says, "Lord, take over," but inside it often means, "as long as I feel safe." True surrender removes these conditions, and removing conditions is frightening, because it means you no longer decide where your life must go. You allow God to interrupt, to redirect, to delay, to close doors you wanted open, to open doors you never asked for. Saint Thérèse would say this is where surrender becomes real, not in prayers, but in permissions, permission for God to disappoint your expectations, permission for God to stretch your faith, permission for God to lead you where you would not choose on your own. This is the cost. And this cost is not paid once, it is paid daily. Every time the soul chooses trust over control, every time it accepts not knowing, every time it lets go of how things should be, the heart resists because control feels like safety. Control says, "If I manage, I won't be hurt." Surrender says, "Even if I am hurt, I will trust." Saint Thérèse would say that God does not lead to protect you from every pain. He leads to free you from being ruled by fear of pain. This is why few truly surrender, not because they do not love God, but because they love certainty, they love predictability, they love emotional security, they love knowing what comes next. God often removes these to teach trust. Letting God lead means accepting that your life will not always make sense to you, that obedience may feel like loss, that surrender may feel like weakness. But Thérèse would say, this weakness is not failure, it is dependence, and dependence is the doorway to intimacy. God does not want to be one voice among many in your life. He wants to be the voice you trust most. That is costly, because it means every other voice becomes secondary. Your fears, your preferences, your past wounds, your need for control. Letting God lead is not poetic, it is practical. It changes decisions, it changes timing, it changes direction. And every change asks the same quiet question: do you trust me enough to follow? Even here. This is the beginning of surrender, and this is where the cost first becomes real. One of the hidden costs of letting God lead your life is the slow dismantling of self-protection. Self-protection feels wise. It feels mature. It feels necessary. It says, "I've learned from pain." It says, "I won't let that happen again." It says, "I need to guard my heart." Saint Thérèse would never deny the reality of wounds, but she would gently warn that self-protection, when it becomes a way of life, slowly replaces trust. The soul begins to make decisions not based on love, but based on fear. Fear of being disappointed, fear of being misunderstood, fear of losing what feels stable, fear of being hurt again. And fear is a powerful guide, but it is not a holy one. Letting God lead means allowing Him to guide you even through areas where your instinct says, protect yourself. This is one of the most painful costs, because protection feels like survival. Surrender feels like risk. The soul says, if I let go, I could be hurt. God says, if you hold on, you will be limited. Saint Thérèse would say that God is not careless with your heart, but He is also not governed by your fear. He sees what you cannot, that some protections are no longer necessary, that some walls were built for seasons that have already passed, that some defenses now block love more than they block pain. This is terrifying, because walls feel safe, but walls also isolate. Letting God lead means letting Him touch the places where you learned to close, not to expose you recklessly, but to heal what made you close. The soul often thinks, if I trust, I lose control. Saint Thérèse would say yes, and that is where love begins. Because love is not safe, it is faithful. Faithful even when outcomes are uncertain, faithful even when wounds are possible, faithful even when there are no guarantees. This does not mean foolishness, it means obedience. Obedience to God's leading instead of obedience to fear. Fear says, stay where you are safe. God says, come where you will be free. Freedom and safety are not the same. Safety avoids pain. Freedom risks love. Saint Thérèse would say that the soul must choose which one it wants to be led by. The soul that chooses safety will live carefully. The soul that chooses freedom will live by trust. Both may look faithful, but only one is surrendered. This is why few truly surrender. Not because surrender is impossible, but because surrender feels like exposure, and exposure is uncomfortable. Letting God lead means allowing Him to reopen places you closed for survival, not to hurt you again, but to heal you deeply. This healing feels like risk, but it is the only way love can fully enter, and where love fully enters, fear loses its authority. This is one of the highest costs, but it is also one of the greatest freedoms. One of the most confusing costs of letting God lead is that His path often does not make sense to human logic. The soul expects that if God is leading, things will become clearer, that decisions will feel obvious, that the next step will feel safe. Saint Thérèse would gently say, God often leads by obscurity, not clarity. Not because He wants to confuse the soul, but because He wants to form trust. If you could always understand God's direction, you would be trusting your understanding more than you are trusting Him. And God wants your trust. This is deeply uncomfortable for the soul that values certainty. The soul wants signs, explanations, confirmations, guarantees. God often gives enough light for the next step, but not enough for the whole path. This is deliberate, because knowing the whole path would make surrender unnecessary. You would be following a map, not a person. Saint Thérèse would say that God does not want you to follow a plan. He wants you to follow Him. This means walking into situations where you cannot yet see the outcome, where obedience feels like risk, where faith feels like stepping into fog. The soul says, if I knew how this would end, I could trust. God says, if you trusted, you would not need to know how it will end. This is the cost of not knowing, the cost of walking without guarantees, the cost of letting go of mental control, the cost of saying yes without seeing the full picture. This feels irresponsible to the natural mind, but it is deeply biblical, deeply spiritual, deeply relational. Saint Thérèse trusted God's heart more than she trusted her understanding. That is why her surrender was so radical. She did not need to know what would happen. She needed to know who was leading. This changes the entire posture of the soul. The soul stops asking, is this safe? And begins to ask, is this you? This is a different kind of discernment, not based on comfort, but based on relationship. God may lead you into silence, into waiting, into loss, into simplicity, into hiddenness, into paths you would not have chosen, not to punish you, but to free you. Because some of the things you are holding on to feel necessary, but are actually limiting your spiritual growth. God often removes clarity to remove dependence on clarity. He removes visible certainty to build invisible trust. This is why few truly surrender, not because they do not believe, but because they want to believe without losing control. Letting God lead means letting Him choose how much you see. Sometimes that is very little, but Saint Thérèse would say, even in the fog, God's hand is steady, and if His hand is steady, the soul can walk, not because it sees, but because it trusts. This is not passive faith, it is courageous faith. The courage to move without full understanding. The courage to say yes to God's direction, even when your emotions hesitate. This courage is costly, but it is also the courage that shapes saints. One of the most misunderstood ways God leads a surrendered soul is through waiting. The soul often believes that if God is leading, things should move forward. Doors should open, answers should come, progress should be visible. Saint Thérèse would gently say, Sometimes God leads by stopping you, not to punish, not to confuse, but to deepen. Waiting feels like abandonment to the human heart. Silence feels like distance. Delay feels like rejection. But in God's logic, waiting is often preparation. The soul wants movement. God often wants formation. Formation happens best when the soul cannot rely on activity, because activity can hide attachment, activity can hide fear, activity can hide lack of trust. Waiting removes these hiding places. In waiting, the soul must face itself, its impatience, its need for control, its fear of being forgotten, its belief that value comes from productivity. Saint Thérèse would say that waiting is one of the greatest purifications of love, because love that only trusts God when things move is still conditional. Waiting asks, do you trust me even when nothing is happening? This is a painful question, because the soul wants proof that God is working. God often gives something harder. He gives opportunity to trust without proof. Silence works the same way. The soul prays and hears nothing. The soul asks and receives no clear answer. The soul waits and time passes. Saint Thérèse would say, silence is not God ignoring you. It is God deepening your listening. Because when God speaks too quickly, the soul listens to the message. When God is silent, the soul learns to listen to Him, to His presence, to His faithfulness, to His nearness beyond words. This kind of listening is relational, not informational. It teaches the soul to rest in God, not just to receive instructions from God. This is costly, because it strips away the feeling of being useful. The soul feels unproductive, unimportant, forgotten. Saint Thérèse would say, this feeling is not truth, it is a test of attachment. Are you attached to being led or to feeling led? These are not the same. God may be leading you very deeply while giving you very little to see. This is the cost of trusting invisible work. Roots grow in darkness, foundations are laid underground. The soul does not see them, but without them, nothing stands. God often uses waiting to grow roots. Roots of humility, roots of patience, roots of trust, roots of surrender. Without these, visible fruit would collapse. This is why waiting is leadership, not leadership that feels active, but leadership that shapes the soul for what comes next. Saint Thérèse would say, if God has you waiting, it is because something in you is being prepared to receive what you are asking for. Not externally, internally. And internal readiness matters more to God than external speed. This is one of the most expensive costs of surrender. To let God set the pace, to let Him decide when, to trust that silence is not absence, but presence working quietly. One of the quiet costs of letting God lead is that He slowly changes how you measure your life. The world measures success by results, by visibility, by recognition, by progress that can be shown. God often measures success by faithfulness. This creates inner conflict. The soul wants to see fruit. God often wants to form roots. The soul wants confirmation. God often wants trust. Saint Thérèse would say that many souls abandon surrender, not because they stop loving God, but because they stop feeling successful. They begin to think, nothing is happening. I am not making progress. My life doesn't look spiritual enough. But God is not forming a resume. He is forming a heart, and a heart cannot be measured the way achievements are measured. Letting God lead means accepting that your life may look smaller, quieter, and less impressive than you imagined, not because you failed, but because God chose a different kind of fruit that grows inward, humility, patience, gentleness, trust, availability. These do not attract applause, but they attract grace. Saint Thérèse lived a hidden life. No great missions, no public miracles, no visible accomplishments, and yet her interior life changed the world. Because God measures impact differently. He measures depth. He measures purity of intention. He measures surrender. This is costly, because the soul still wants to feel useful. The soul still wants to feel like it matters. God does not remove that desire. He purifies it. He teaches the soul to matter to Him, even when it does not feel like it matters to the world. This is one of the deepest costs, letting go of being seen, letting go of needing to prove worth, letting go of comparing your path to others. Saint Thérèse would say that comparison is one of the quickest ways to resist God's leading, because comparison makes you follow others' paths, instead of God's path for you. God's path for you may be quieter, slower, hidden, simple, not because it is less important, but because it is precisely what your soul needs. Letting God redefine success means trusting that holiness is not measured by how much you do, but by how much you belong. This is hard for the active soul, hard for the ambitious soul, hard for the soul that wants to feel progress. But God often asks for something deeper, to let your worth come from Him, not from outcomes. This feels like loss of external validation, loss of measurable achievement, loss of being impressive. But Saint Thérèse would say, this loss creates space, space for peace, space for freedom, space for love that is not performing. This is where identity shifts, from what you do to who you belong to. And this shift is costly, but it is also where the soul becomes unshakable. Because when worth comes from God, no failure can take it away, no delay can cancel it, no hiddenness can erase it. This is the freedom that surrender brings. The greatest cost of letting God lead your life is not what you lose. It is who you allow yourself to become. Saint Thérèse would gently say that surrender is not primarily about giving God your circumstances. It is about giving God your identity, your idea of who you should be, your timeline for growth, your expectations of what holiness should look like, your image of what a faithful life must feel like. When God leads, He reshapes these quietly, not by force, but by invitation. And every invitation asks for a deeper yes. Yes to becoming smaller. Yes to becoming more dependent. Yes to becoming more trusting. Yes to becoming less in control. This is frightening to the part of you that wants to manage life, because surrender means you no longer decide who you will be. You allow God to decide, not in big dramatic ways, but in small daily reshaping. The soul often thinks surrender will make life clearer. Sometimes it does, but more often it makes the soul simpler, less defended, less controlling, less self-directed, more available, more trusting, more rooted in God. This feels like loss to the ego, but it feels like freedom to the spirit. Saint Thérèse would say that God is not taking your life from you. He is giving you back your life, purified, stripped of what weighs it down, freed from what limits love, detached from what competes with trust. This is why few truly surrender, not because God is demanding, but because surrender is intimate. It touches identity, it touches control, it touches fear, it touches self-protection, and intimacy always costs more than surface obedience. Letting God lead means accepting that your life will not always feel like your own, not because God erases you, but because God fulfills you in a way you could not design. Saint Thérèse trusted that God knew her better than she knew herself, and that trust made her small, but strong, hidden, but powerful, simple, but free. This is what surrender produces, not dramatic control over life, but deep belonging within it. If you are afraid to let God lead, you are not weak, you are human. But Saint Thérèse would gently whisper, the cost is real, but so is the freedom. The loss is real, but so is the peace. The surrender is real, but so is the love that meets you there. Letting God lead is not easy, but it is where the soul finally rests, not in understanding, not in control, not in certainty, but in Him.